The morning of May 8, 1945, Balikpapan Bay, Borneo. A Japanese destroyer captain scans the horizon through his binoculars, searching for the American aircraft he knows must be out there. His radar operators report nothing unusual, just the familiar blips of distant patrol planes, too far away to threaten his ship. The sky is hazy, visibility moderate. His crew remains at their stations, alert but not alarmed. The Americans have been bombing the oil refineries for weeks, but his destroyer has survived every raid through a combination of aggressive maneuvering and accurate anti-aircraft fire. He knows the drill: spot the bombers early, track their approach, open fire when they enter range, turn hard when they begin their attack runs. His ship has shot down 3 American planes in the past month alone. Then something changes. His radar operators report aircraft approaching from the south, but they're maintaining distance roughly 20 miles out, far beyond effective bombing range. The captain relaxes slightly. American bombers typically press much closer before releasing their payloads. Perhaps this is just another reconnaissance flight. But then, without warning, without any visible change in the distant aircraft's behavior, his ship shudders from a massive explosion amidships. The blast tears through the destroyer's hull below the waterline, flooding 2 compartments instantly. Sailors rush to damage control stations, confusion mixing with practiced discipline. The captain's mind races through the possibilities. A submarine torpedo? Impossible. His sonar operators reported no contacts. A mine? They're well clear of known minefields. Another explosion, this one near the stern, answers his unspoken question with devastating finality. His ship is under attack, but from what? The American planes remain distant specks on the horizon, 20 miles away, far beyond any weapon he's ever encountered. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What the Japanese captain couldn't have known, what no Japanese naval officer could have fully understood in those final months of the war, was that he'd just become one of the first combat victims of a weapon that represented a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare itself. The weapon had no pilot, no visible approach, and required no aircraft to venture into the deadly envelope of anti-aircraft fire that had protected Japanese warships throughout the war. It was called the Bat, and it was hunting with eyes that could see through clouds, through darkness, through the smoke and confusion of battle eyes made not of glass and human nerve, but of radio waves and electronic circuits. The story of the Bat missile begins not in the laboratories of weapons designers, but in the fundamental problem that had plagued naval aviation since the first aircraft dropped the first bomb on the first ship. To sink a warship, you had to fly close enough to aim accurately, and flying close enough to aim accurately meant flying close enough to be shot down. The mathematics of this deadly equation had been calculated in blood across every naval battle of World War II. At Midway, at Coral Sea, at Philippine Sea, American torpedo and dive bombers had pressed their attacks through walls of anti-aircraft fire, accepting catastrophic losses to deliver their weapons with any hope of accuracy. The Japanese had faced the same brutal calculus, their skilled naval aviators dying by the thousands as they flew their obsolete aircraft into modern American air defense networks. By late 1943, American military planners understood that this equation had to change. The Imperial Japanese Navy, despite massive losses, still possessed hundreds of warships scattered across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean. Every one of those ships represented a target that would cost American lives to destroy using conventional bombing techniques. The USAAF and Navy had spent 2 years learning hard lessons about the realities of attacking defended ships. A good dive bomber pilot, approaching from 15,000 feet, might achieve a circular error of 200 feet under ideal conditions, and ideal conditions never existed in combat. Anti-aircraft fire, evasive maneuvering, smoke screens, and the simple terror of flying into a storm of exploding steel all degraded accuracy dramatically. The Navy calculated that, on average, It took 96 bombing sorties to achieve a single hit on a maneuvering destroyer. 96 aircraft, 96 crews, 96 opportunities to be shot down, all for one bomb impact. The Germans had recognized this same problem and had responded with radio-controlled glide bombs, the Fritz X and Henschel 293. These weapons, guided by operators in the launching aircraft using radio commands and visual observation, had achieved shocking success in the Mediterranean. On September 9, 1943, a Fritz X had struck the Italian battleship Roma with such precision that the ship's magazine detonated, killing over 1,300 men and sending one of the most powerful warships in the Mediterranean to the bottom in minutes. The Americans studied these weapons carefully and understood both their potential and their critical weakness. They required the launch aircraft to remain in the target area throughout the weapon's flight, maintaining visual contact and transmitting guidance commands. This meant flying in circles over heavily defended targets, presenting a stable, predictable target to anti-aircraft gunners, often for several minutes. The Germans were losing their bomber crews almost as fast as they were sinking ships. The Americans needed something different. They needed a weapon that could be released from beyond the effective range of anti-aircraft fire, that required no human guidance after launch, that could find and track its target autonomously through any weather condition at any time of day or night. They needed, in essence, to create an artificial pilot, one that couldn't be killed, couldn't panic, couldn't miss due to human error or fear. They needed radar. Radar had already transformed warfare by 1943. British radar had won the Battle of Britain, providing early warning of German bomber raids and allowing outnumbered RAF fighters to intercept with devastating effectiveness. American shipboard radar had turned the tide at Guadalcanal, allowing U.S. Navy vessels to detect and engage Japanese warships in night battles where visual sighting was impossible. But using radar to guide a weapon to its target represented an entirely different order of technological challenge. The radar system had to be small enough and light enough to fit inside a weapon that could be carried by an aircraft. It had to be rugged enough to survive the violent launch from a bomber, the air turbulence of high-speed flight, and the shock of impact. It had to be sophisticated enough to distinguish a ship from the surrounding ocean surface, to track a moving target, and to guide the weapon's control surfaces accordingly. And it had to be cheap enough to be expendable, because unlike the aircraft carrying it, the radar would be destroyed with every use. The National Bureau of Standards took on the challenge in 1943, working in collaboration with the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance and several private contractors. The result was a technological marvel that pushed the absolute limits of 1940s electronics. The AN/APS-23 radar unit weighed just 78 pounds, a fraction of the weight of shipboard radar systems that performed similar functions. It operated at a frequency of 35 GHz, far higher than most contemporary radar systems, allowing for a tighter beam and more precise target resolution. The radar's transmitter generated just enough power to detect a ship-sized target at ranges up to 20 miles, but no more. Every ounce mattered. Every watt of power had to be justified in terms of weight savings. The weapon that would carry this radar brain was designated ASMN-2, but universally known by its operational code name, BAT. The name was apt. Like its biological namesake, the BAT navigated by bouncing radio waves off its target and following the returning echoes. The weapon was a glide bomb, not a powered missile. It had no engine, relying instead on altitude and aerodynamic lift to reach its target. A PBY Liberator heavy bomber would carry the BAT to 30,000 feet, far above effective anti-aircraft range, and release it while still 20 miles from the target. The BAT would then glide toward its prey, descending gradually, its radar scanning the ocean surface ahead, searching for the distinctive radar return of a steel hull. The guidance system was elegantly simple in concept but fiendishly difficult in execution. The radar's returns fed into an analog computer, a collection of vacuum tubes, resistors, and capacitors that processed the incoming signals and calculated the steering commands needed to guide the weapon toward the target. 4 control surfaces on the bat's tail responded to these commands, adjusting the glide path continuously. If the target maneuvered, the radar would detect the movement and the guidance system would adjust accordingly. If the target deployed smoke screens, the radar would see through them. If clouds obscured visual observation, the radar would track regardless. The weapon was autonomous in the truest sense once released. No human intervention was possible or necessary. The bat measured 12 feet long with a wingspan of 10 feet. It weighed 1,000 pounds at launch, with a 1,000-pound general-purpose bomb as its warhead. Its stubby wings and streamlined body gave it a glide ratio of roughly 4:1 for every 1,000 feet of altitude. It could travel roughly 4,000 feet horizontally. Launched from 30,000 feet, it had a theoretical maximum range of 23 miles, though practical combat range was closer to 20 miles to ensure adequate terminal velocity for armor penetration. Testing began in early 1944 at the Naval Air Station in Traverse City, Michigan, and later at Naval Air Station Patuxent River in Maryland. The results were extraordinary. In controlled conditions against stationary ship targets, the bat achieved hit rates exceeding 60%, a revolutionary improvement over conventional bombing. Even more remarkably, the weapon demonstrated the ability to discriminate between ships of different sizes, consistently selecting the largest radar return when multiple targets were present. The radar could detect a destroyer-sized target at maximum range and maintain tracking lock through the entire glide phase. Weather conditions that would have grounded conventional bombing missions had no effect on the bat's performance. But the Navy understood that test range performance meant little. The weapon would have to prove itself in combat against real targets that shot back, against Japanese crews who would do everything in their power to survive. The first combat deployment came in the spring of 1945, as American forces closed in on the Japanese home islands. By then, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been shattered as an effective fighting force. The catastrophic defeat at Philippine Sea in June 1944, followed by the destruction of the Japanese carrier force at Leyte Gulf in October, had left Japan with few major warships and virtually no carrier aviation capability. But hundreds of smaller vessels remained, destroyers, destroyer escorts, frigates, and patrol craft scattered across the Empire's shrinking defensive perimeter. These ships posed significant threats to American amphibious operations and supply lines, and they remained difficult targets for conventional attack. The Japanese Navy had adapted to American air superiority through tactics that maximized their remaining strengths. They operated primarily at night or in bad weather, when American airstrikes were least effective. They stayed close to coastlines where they could quickly reach the protection of land-based anti-aircraft batteries. They dispersed rather than concentrating, making themselves harder to find and attack. And they had become masters of ship handling, maneuvering violently the moment attacking aircraft were spotted, throwing off the aim of bomb and torpedo runs. Their anti-aircraft gunnery had improved dramatically through bitter experience. Japanese gunners knew exactly how American dive bombers attacked, knew the altitudes they preferred, knew the release points they favored. By early 1945, attacking a Japanese destroyer with conventional weapons required either accepting heavy losses or expending enormous numbers of sorties to achieve results. The bat promised to change this calculus entirely. On April 23, 1945, PBY liberators from Patrol Bombing Squadron VPB 109, operating from Clark Field in the Philippines, conducted the weapon's first combat mission. The target was a Japanese destroyer operating in the Sulu Sea between the Philippines and Borneo. The destroyer's captain knew American aircraft were in the area. His radar had detected them, maintaining a patrol pattern well outside his ship's anti-aircraft range. He'd seen this before. The Americans would shadow Japanese vessels for hours, calling in strike packages, waiting for an opening. His crew remained at battle stations, ready to maneuver violently the moment the Americans began their attack run. The attack run never came. The PBY maintained its distance, circling lazily at 28,000 feet, seemingly content to merely observe. The destroyer's captain considered his options. Darkness would fall in a few hours. If he could maintain his current course and speed until then, he could break contact and reach the relative safety of the coastal waters around Borneo. American bombers rarely pressed attacks in darkness. The risk of controlled flight into terrain was too great, and the accuracy of night bombing made such missions wasteful. He had every reason to feel confident. Then the bat fell away from the PBY's weapons bay, and the destroyer's fate was sealed, though no one aboard knew it yet. The bat's radar activated moments after release, its transmitter sending pulses of radio energy sweeping across the ocean below. The destroyer appeared on the radar scope as a bright return, clearly distinguishable from the surrounding water. The guidance computer processed the information, calculated the intercept course, and adjusted the control surfaces. The weapon began its long glide toward the target, descending at a steady rate, maintaining an optimal angle of attack that balanced speed against range. Aboard the destroyer, nothing seemed amiss. The American aircraft remained distant. No dive bombers appeared overhead. No torpedo planes skimmed low across the water. The ship maintained its course, making 18 knots toward the safety of the coast. Lookouts scanned the sky constantly, but they were looking for aircraft, for the distinctive silhouette of a diving bomber, for the telltale white contrails of an approaching strike group. None of them were looking for a weapon they didn't know existed, approaching from an altitude and distance they didn't know was possible. The bat covered the 20 miles in approximately 9 minutes. As it descended through 10,000 feet, it became theoretically visible to observers on the ship, but only as a small, dark shape against a hazy sky easily mistaken for a bird, if noticed at all. The weapon's glide was smooth, almost serene, nothing like the violent, screaming dive of a conventional bomber. There was no engine roar to warn of its approach, no formation of aircraft to alert defensive gunners, just a silent, methodical descent guided by invisible radio waves. At 2,000 feet, the destroyer's lookouts finally spotted something wrong. A shape was growing larger in the sky, approaching from astern at a shallow angle. Battle stations' klaxons sounded throughout the ship. Gun crews traversed their weapons toward the approaching object, trying to identify it, trying to understand what they were seeing. It wasn't behaving like any aircraft they'd encountered. It wasn't diving. It wasn't maneuvering. It was simply coming straight at them with the inevitability of a falling stone. The first anti-aircraft rounds began firing when the bat was at 800 feet, but by then it was far too late. The weapon had accelerated to over 300 miles per hour in its terminal dive, and the guidance system was making constant micro-adjustments to keep it locked onto the target. The destroyer's captain ordered emergency maneuvering hard to port, full speed, but the ship's turning radius was measured in hundreds of yards, and the bat was adjusting its course to compensate faster than the destroyer could turn. Impact came at the waterline, just forward of the destroyer's engine room. The 1,000-pound warhead detonated on contact, punching through the ship's hull plating and exploding inside the vessel. The blast ruptured fuel tanks, collapsed bulkheads, and opened the hull to the sea. Secondary explosions followed as aviation fuel and ammunition cooked off in the fires that erupted throughout the ship's interior. The destroyer began listing immediately, taking on water faster than damage control crews could contain the flooding. Within 20 minutes, the captain gave the order to abandon ship. 37 minutes after the bat's impact, the destroyer rolled over and sank, taking 48 members of her crew to the bottom. The PBY that had launched the weapon circled, overhead, photographing the results. The crew watched in professional satisfaction as the destroyer settled beneath the waves. They had just participated in a perfect test of the new weapon system. One aircraft, one weapon, one sortie, one destroyer sunk, no aircraft lost, no crew members injured, no risk of anti-aircraft fire. The mathematics of naval warfare had just been fundamentally rewritten. Over the following weeks, VPB 109 and other squadrons equipped with the Bat conducted dozens of missions against Japanese shipping throughout the Philippines, the South China Sea, and the waters around Borneo. The results were consistently devastating. Japanese ships had no effective counter to the weapon. Their radar systems, less sophisticated than American equivalents, often failed to detect the Bat during its glide, and even when they did detect something, operators struggled to understand what they were seeing. The radar return was too small for an aircraft, moving too fast for a ship, approaching from angles and altitudes that made no tactical sense. Japanese anti-aircraft doctrine, developed through years of combat against conventional American bombing attacks, was completely ineffective against the Bat. Gunners had trained to track diving bombers, to calculate lead angles for high-speed torpedo planes, to mass fire against formations of approaching strike aircraft. The Bat presented none of these familiar profiles. It approached individually, not in formations. It glided rather than diving steeply. Its small size and relatively slow speed by aircraft standards meant that even when gunners managed to train their weapons on it, calculating the proper lead and elevation was nearly impossible in the few seconds available before impact. Evasive maneuvering, the cornerstone of Japanese anti-torpedo tactics, proved equally useless. A destroyer captain facing a torpedo attack could turn his ship to present the smallest possible target profile and could time his maneuvers to throw off the attacker's aim. But the Bat didn't require aim in the conventional sense. Its radar locked onto the ship's hull and tracked continuously throughout the glide. When a ship maneuvered, the guidance system simply adjusted the weapon's flight path to compensate. The tighter a ship turned, the more it slowed, making it an easier target for a weapon that was constantly calculating intercept courses. Smoke screens, which had proven effective against visual bombing attacks, were completely transparent to radar. Japanese ships often deployed smoke as a defensive measure, generating dense clouds that made visual targeting impossible. American dive bombers and torpedo planes had frequently been forced to abort attacks when their targets disappeared into smoke. The Bat's radar saw through smoke as if it didn't exist, tracking the solid metal hull underneath regardless of visual obscuration. Even weather, which had always been the defender's best friend, provided no protection. Japanese ships had learned to operate in conditions that grounded most American airstrikes: heavy, overcast, rain, fog, rough seas. The Bat's radar was unaffected by any of these conditions. A ship hiding in a rain squall was as visible to the weapon's radar as one sailing in clear sunshine. Night operations, once a significant Japanese tactical advantage, became meaningless when attacking aircraft could launch weapons that hunted in the dark with electronic eyes. The psychological impact on Japanese naval crews was profound and demoralizing. Sailors could understand conventional attacks. They could see dive bombers approaching, could watch torpedo planes making their runs, could fire back and feel like they were defending themselves. Against the Bat, there was nothing to see until it was too late, nothing to shoot at effectively, no sense of being able to fight back. The weapon simply appeared and struck, and ships died. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese naval intelligence struggled to understand what was happening. Initial reports from surviving ships described weapons that appeared to guide themselves toward targets, but this seemed impossible. Guided weapons were known. The Germans had demonstrated radio-controlled bombs, but those required the launching aircraft to remain in the area, transmitting guidance commands. American aircraft launching Bats were observed, departing immediately after weapon release, sometimes before the weapon even struck. How could a weapon guide itself without radio commands from its launching platform? Some Japanese officers theorized that the Americans had developed a form of television guidance with a camera in the weapon's nose, transmitting images back to the launching aircraft. but this didn't explain how the weapons functioned at night or in bad weather when visual guidance would be impossible. Others suggested that American pilots were somehow flying the weapons by remote control from extreme distances, perhaps using very high-frequency radio that Japanese receivers couldn't detect. This theory also failed to explain the weapon's all-weather capability and the observed fact that launching aircraft often flew away immediately after release. The correct answer that the Americans had miniaturized radar technology to the point where it could fit inside an expendable weapon and had developed guidance computers sophisticated enough to autonomously track and intercept moving targets was almost beyond the imagination of Japanese engineers in 1945. Japan had developed radar technology, but their systems were bulky, power-hungry, and temperamental. The idea of reducing such a system to fit inside a 1,000-pound bomb, making it reliable enough for field use, and producing it in quantity, seemed like science fiction. The technological gap between Japanese and American electronics was measured not in years but in decades. By May 1945, the bat had proven itself repeatedly in combat. The weapon achieved a documented hit rate of approximately 38% in combat conditions, dramatically lower than test-range results, but still revolutionary compared to conventional bombing. The difference reflected the realities of combat: targets that maneuvered violently, radar interference from land masses and weather effects, damaged or malfunctioning guidance systems, and operational errors in targeting and launch procedures. But even a 38% hit rate meant that 3 aircraft carrying bats could accomplish what would have previously required dozens of conventional bombers, and could do so with minimal risk to aircrews. The weapon saw extensive use during the Borneo campaign, where Japanese destroyers and escort vessels attempted to reinforce isolated garrisons and evacuate personnel as Allied forces closed in. On May 1, 1945, bats struck and damaged 2 destroyers and sank a destroyer escort in a single day of operations. On May 8, the day Germany surrendered in Europe, a bat sank the destroyer featured at this story's opening in Balikpapan Bay. Throughout May and into June, the weapon continued to prove its effectiveness, sinking or damaging more than a dozen Japanese vessels of various types. The Imperial Japanese Navy's response to the bat threat evolved slowly, hampered by lack of understanding of the weapon's operating principles. Since they didn't realize the weapon used radar guidance, they couldn't develop effective countermeasures. Some ships attempted to install additional anti-aircraft guns, but this provided little benefit against a weapon that approached outside the effective range of most shipboard weapons until its final seconds of flight. Other vessels tried operating in waters too shallow for the bat's glide path, but this confined them to coastal areas where they were vulnerable to other forms of attack. A few innovative Japanese commanders developed a tactic of stationing lookouts with instructions to watch the American patrol planes rather than the sky around their own ship. If they saw something fall from an aircraft 20 miles away, they would immediately order maximum speed and violent maneuvering in random patterns, hoping to throw off whatever guidance system the weapon used. This approach occasionally worked. The bat's guidance system could compensate for steady maneuvering, but could be confused by rapid, random course changes, especially if initiated early in the weapon's flight. But such tactics required spotting the weapon's launch, which was often impossible due to distance, weather, or the simple fact that lookouts couldn't watch every American aircraft in the area simultaneously. The broader implications of the bat extended far beyond its immediate combat effectiveness. The weapon represented the first practical application of autonomous guidance technology in warfare, the first system that could detect, track, and attack a target without direct human control after launch. This was a watershed moment in military technology, though few people fully recognized it at the time. Previous guided weapons had required constant human input. A pilot flying an aircraft controlled every aspect of the attack personally. Radio-controlled bombs required an operator in the launching aircraft to watch the weapon's flight and transmit steering commands. Even wire-guided weapons required continuous human control throughout their flight. The bat needed none of this. A human selected the target and launched the weapon, but from that point forward, the attack proceeded automatically according to the laws of physics and the logic of electronic circuits. This autonomous capability created several significant advantages beyond the obvious benefit of removing aircraft from effective anti-aircraft range. First, it eliminated human reaction time from the guidance loop. The bat's radar and guidance computer could detect target movements and respond with adjustments faster than any human operator, making the weapon more effective against maneuvering targets. Second, it removed human judgment errors from the attack sequence. A human bomb aimer might misidentify a target, might misjudge range or altitude, might hesitate at a critical moment. The bat's systems operated with mechanical consistency, free from fear, fatigue, or confusion. Third, and perhaps most significantly, autonomous guidance meant that one aircraft could theoretically attack multiple targets on a single mission. Previous guided weapons required one launching aircraft per target, since the aircraft had to remain in the area guiding the weapon until impact. With the bat, an aircraft could launch one weapon at a target, then immediately maneuver to attack another target with a second weapon, or could simply leave the area entirely. This force multiplication effect made each attacking aircraft dramatically more effective. The weapon also demonstrated the growing importance of electronics in modern warfare. The bat succeeded because of its radar and guidance computer, not because of any advancement in aerodynamics or explosives. The bomb itself was conventional. The airframe was relatively simple. The revolutionary component was the electronic brain that gave the weapon its ability to hunt autonomously. This pattern victory through electronic sophistication rather than mechanical brute force would come to dominate military technology for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. American industry produced approximately 300 bat weapons during World War II. Production was limited by the complexity of the radar and guidance systems, which required precision manufacturing and extensive testing. Each weapon cost approximately $5,000 in 1945 currency, expensive by the standards of conventional bombs, but cheap compared to losing an aircraft and crew. The Navy had planned to expand production dramatically for the invasion of Japan, projecting production of several thousand weapons per month by late 1945. These plans became moot when Japan surrendered in August, but they indicate the Navy's confidence in the weapon's effectiveness. The bat's combat record was ultimately limited by the weapon's late introduction and by the rapid collapse of Japanese naval power in the war's final months. By the time the weapon became operational in spring 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy had already been effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Most of the bat's targets were small vessels engaged in transport and evacuation missions rather than major warships engaged in fleet operations. This was not a limitation of the weapon itself, but simply a reflection of the strategic situation. There were few major Japanese warships left to attack by May 1945. Nevertheless, the weapon demonstrated capabilities that would have been strategically significant if employed earlier in the war. If the bat had been available during the Philippine Sea Campaign in June 1944, American aircraft could have attacked the Japanese carrier fleet from beyond the range of Japanese fighters, potentially sinking multiple carriers without the heavy air-to-air combat losses that characterized that battle. If available during the Leyte Gulf operation in October 1944, bats could have engaged the Japanese center force while it was still far from the invasion beaches, possibly preventing the surface engagement off Samar that nearly resulted in disaster for American escort carriers. The weapon's most significant legacy was not its actual combat employment, but rather the technological path it opened. The bat was the direct ancestor of modern anti-ship missiles, which employ the same basic concept, autonomous guidance using radar or other sensors to attack surface vessels beyond visual range. Every anti-ship missile developed since 1945, from the Soviet Styx to the American Harpoon to modern systems like the Naval Strike Missile, owes its conceptual heritage to the bat's pioneering design. The weapon also influenced the development of air-to-air missiles. If radar could guide a weapon to a ship, it could theoretically guide a weapon to an aircraft. The same laboratories that developed the bat's guidance systems went on to develop the radar guidance systems for early air-to-air missiles like the AIM-7 Sparrow. The technological lineage is direct and clear. The bat demonstrated that autonomous radar guidance was practical, reliable, and effective, providing the proof of concept that justified massive investment in guided missile technology throughout the Cold War. For the Japanese sailors who encountered the bat in combat, the weapon represented a fundamentally unfair development in warfare, an enemy that struck invisibly, against which there was no effective defense. This sentiment was not unique to Japanese forces. Throughout military history, new weapons have consistently provoked accusations of unfairness from those on the receiving end. English longbowmen were accused of ungentlemanly warfare by French knights. Rifled muskets were considered unsporting by soldiers accustomed to smoothbore weapons. Machine guns were denounced as barbaric when they first appeared. The submarine was called a coward's weapon. The Japanese themselves had pioneered carrier aviation, which allowed them to attack Pearl Harbor from beyond visual range, and they had employed kamikaze tactics that struck without warning. The bat was simply the latest evolution in the eternal arms race between offense and defense. What made the bat particularly devastating to Japanese morale was not merely its effectiveness, but its revelation of the technological chasm that had opened between American and Japanese industrial capabilities. Japanese sailors and officers understood ships, they understood aircraft, they understood guns and torpedoes and bombs. These were all technologies they possessed themselves, where the difference between American and Japanese versions was a matter of degree rather than kind. American ships were more numerous and better equipped, but they were still recognizably ships, operating on the same principles as Japanese vessels. The bat was different. It represented a level of technological sophistication that Japanese industry could not match and could barely comprehend. The miniaturization of radar, the development of reliable guidance computers, the integration of complex electronic systems into a weapon that had to survive violent launch stresses and high-speed flight. These achievements were beyond Japan's industrial and scientific capabilities. By 1945, the weapon didn't just sink ships, it demonstrated that America had reached a level of technological development where it could create weapons that seemed almost magical to its enemies. This realization was profoundly demoralizing. Japanese military culture emphasized spirit, training, and martial virtue as decisive factors in warfare. Skill and determination could overcome material disadvantage. This was a core belief of Japanese military doctrine. But how could spirit overcome a weapon you couldn't see coming, couldn't effectively shoot down, and couldn't evade? How could training help when the enemy possessed technological capabilities you didn't even understand? The bat, like so many other American technological achievements in the war's final year, made it clear that the conflict had transcended human factors and become a contest of industrial and scientific capability that Japan had no hope of winning. The survivors of ships sunk by bats carried their experiences back to Japan, spreading stories of American wonder weapons throughout the remnants of the Imperial Navy. These accounts contributed to a growing sense of hopelessness that pervaded Japanese military circles by mid-1945. If the Americans could build bombs that steered themselves, what other impossibilities had they achieved? The rumors multiplied. Bombs that could destroy entire cities with a single explosion, aircraft that flew faster than sound, ships that could travel underwater indefinitely without surfacing. Some of these rumors were true, the atomic bomb was real, and jet aircraft were already flying. Others were exaggerations or misunderstandings. But the point was that Japanese military personnel believed them all, because they'd seen what American technology could achieve with the bat. In the final analysis, the bat missile achieved something more significant than its relatively modest number of confirmed kills. It demonstrated that the future of warfare lay in electronic systems, autonomous guidance, and standoff attack concepts that would dominate military technology for the next 8 decades and counting. The weapon proved that human pilots didn't need to place themselves at risk to deliver weapons accurately against defended targets. It showed that radar could be miniaturized and rugged enough for field use in expendable weapons. It established that analog computers could process sensor data and execute complex guidance tasks reliably without human intervention. The Japanese destroyer captain, who died in Balikpapan Bay on May 8, 1945, was among the first to face a type of warfare that has since become commonplace. Modern naval commanders operate in an environment where radar-guided anti-ship missiles are ubiquitous, where autonomous weapons engage targets beyond visual range, where electronic systems often determine the outcome of engagements before human operators even realize they're under attack. That captain couldn't have understood the historical significance of the weapon that killed his ship, but he experienced firsthand the future of naval warfare, a future where the electromagnetic spectrum matters as much as the visible one, where computers make life or death decisions in microseconds, and where the geometry of engagement is measured in radar ranges rather than gun ranges. The bat flew for only a few months before Japan's surrender ended the Pacific War. But in those few months, it sank and damaged enough Japanese vessels to prove its concept, to justify its development costs, and to establish the foundation for every guided missile system that would follow. The weapon's combat career was brief, but its influence was profound and permanent. Every modern warship, bristling with anti-ship missiles, every aircraft carrying radar-guided weapons, every autonomous system that hunts targets without direct human control, all of them trace their lineage back to those first bats, gliding silently through Pacific skies in the spring of 1945, hunting with electronic eyes, striking without warning, heralding a new era in the ancient art of war. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.